Don't forget to check out the official TheCommanderGuys Discord server. It's the best way to stay in touch with the community, our players, and Devin and I. If you want to support the channel, you can do so directly over on our newly revamped Patreon, and join Morello here in this list. Alternatively, you can support us at no additional cost to yourself whenever you make a purchase over at TCG Player. Simply start any purchase you want to make by clicking our affiliate link down in the description, and a portion of your total price will go back to the channel. Thanks as always for your support. Hey everyone, and welcome to another TheCommanderGuys gameplay video. This week's game was recorded before two of the commanders featured in it were available, and I've done my best to account for that, but I figured I'd mention it now. In all, this game offers up an interesting look at two brand new commanders. So let's not waste any more time, and go ahead and jump straight in to player introductions. First off this week, we have Randall, playing his take on Neyith of the Dire Hunt. It's Gruul Fight Tribal that also has a heavy good stuff theme, and Randall kept Warstorm Surge, Domri Raid, Thunderfoot Baloth, a pair of forests, a mountain, and Sheltered Thicket. Then comes Mark, playing Tinybones Trinket Thief. This is a mono-black disruption deck, which uses both discard and removal to do so, while also triggering Tinybones' abilities. Mark kept Snuff Out, Dismember, Burglar Rat, Soul Ring, Decree of Pain, and a pair of swamps. Next up is Devin, playing Danny's Chainer Dementia Master deck. This deck has been on the channel once before, but as a recap, it focuses on filling his graveyard before using Recursion to bring back valuable creatures. Devin kept Archfiend of Despair, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, Villas Broker of Blood, Noxious Gearhulk, and a pair of snow-covered swamps. Last but certainly not least, we have Danny, playing Raff Capashen, Ship's Mage. This is a combo-oriented deck, which Danny probably describes best himself.
I don't play on my turn.
Danny kept Leveler, Azorius Signet, Archmage's Charm, Narumeha, Master Wizard, an island, and a pair of planes. Randall starts us off. He drops a tapped Sheltered Thicket, and passes turn. Mark drops a tapped Swamp, and uses it to cast a Soul Ring. Devin drops a Swamp as well, and then Danny closes out round 1 with an island. Randall drops a Forest, and passes turn. Mark drops a Swamp. He casts his commander Tinybones, and follows it up with a Burglar Rat. As the rat ETBs, each of Mark's opponents must discard a card, and then at end step, Mark loses a life and draws a card. Devin drops another Swamp, and passes once again. And then Danny drops a Plains, before casting an Azorius Signet. Randall drops a Mountain. He casts Domri Raid, and upticks him. He looks at the top card of his library, and leaves it there, before passing turn. Mark casts a Grim Tutor. He loses 3 life, and tutors a swamp to hand, which he immediately plays for turn.
It was like a Farsi that sucked.
Mark then moves to combat, and swings at Domri, before passing off. Devin drops a 3rd swamp, and passes off. And then Danny drops a Plains, before doing the same. Randall drops a Forest, and then upticks Domri again. He looks at the top card of his library, before revealing a Rishkar Pima Renegade, which he puts to hand. Randall then casts the Sunder Shaman, and passes off. And at his end step, Mark loses 4 life to snuff out the Sunder Shaman. Mark drops a Swamp for turn, and then casts a Gauntlet of Power, naming Black. He then moves to combat, and kills Domri before passing turn. Devin drops a 4th Swamp. He then loses 6 life to cast Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. He follows up with a Harvester of Souls, and loses 4 life to cast it. Before that cast, adds an additional +1/+1 counter to Crick. Devin then passes off, and at his end step, Danny flashes in Raff. Danny drops an island, and decides to pass off. Randall casts an Outpost Siege, naming Cons, and passes off as well. And at his end step, Mark loses 2 life to dismember Harvester of Souls. During his turn, Mark casts Liliana's Spectre, which in turn forces each of his opponents to discard a card as it enters. He follows up with a Necropotence, and in response, Danny flashes in a Gilded Lotus, before using its mana to negate Necropotence. Mark then moves to end step, and draws a card before losing another life, all thanks to Tinybones. Devin casts Siphon Mind, forcing each of his opponents to discard a card, before drawing 3, and also adding a counter to Crick. Devin then drops an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and now people really have to specify what they tap their lands for. Devin then loses 6 more life to cast a Vilis Broker of Blood, which once again adds another counter to Crick. Devin then moves to combat, and hits Danny for 5 with Crick, before gaining 5 from lifelink. He moves to end step, and Tinybones triggers, causing Mark to draw a card and lose a life once again. And as that happens, Danny surprises no one by immediately passing off again. Randall triggers Outpost Siege on his upkeep, and exiles a Farseek with its effect. He casts a Kadama's Reach, and uses it to bring in a tapped forest, and a mountain to hand, which he then plays for turn. Randall follows up by casting the Farseek, and before he goes to search, he also casts a Kenrith's Transformation on Crick. In response to that, Devin activates Vilis, paying 2 life, and drawing 2 cards, while also giving Liliana's Spectre neg1 until end of turn. Crick then becomes an Elk, as Randall brings in a tapped Stomping Ground, and passes off. Mark drops a Swamp. He casts Decree of Pain, and in response, Danny Narsets reversals it. Danny's copy of Decree of Pain wipes the board, and he draws a total of 6 cards. Mark then recasts his commander Tinybones, and passes turn. Devin drops another Swamp. He casts Liliana Dreadhorde General, which Danny puts a hard stop to with the counterspell. Danny uses his floating mana to cast a Dig Through Time, while also delving away his graveyard. Danny looks at the top 7 of his library, and puts 2 of them to hand, before bottoming the rest. Devin then casts Chainer, and passes turn. Danny drops an island, and passes off once again. Randall exiles Dragonlord Atarka with Outpost Siege. He casts Garruk's Uprising, and follows it up with a Goreclaw. He draws from Uprising as Goreclaw enters, and then passes turn. Mark casts Decree of Pain, and wipes the board once again, before drawing 3 cards. He then drops a Swamp, and follows it up with a Smallpox. As Smallpox resolves, each player loses a life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, and then sacrifices a land. Mark follows that up with a Hymn to Tarak targeting Danny, which forces Danny to discard 2 at random, and hits both Burnished Heart and Leveler. With nothing else this turn, Mark passes off. Devin drops another Swamp. He recasts Chainer, and follows it up with a Viscera Seer. Devin then moves to end step, and Danny flashes in Raff. When priority passes for end of turn again, Mark attempts to go for the throat Raff, which Danny arcane denials. Before turn passes again, Devin uses Chainer to reanimate Noxious Gearhulk. And as the Gearhulk ETBs, Devin destroys Raff. Danny untaps, and Arcane Denial's delayed trigger happens, causing Mark to draw 2, while Danny draws 1. Danny then casts Kaiga the Tide Star, and passes turn. Randall exiles Savage Swipe with Outpost Siege. He drops a Kessick Wolf Run, and then casts Ravager Worm. As the worm ETBs, he gives it a +1/+1 counter from Riot, before choosing to have it fight Chainer. In response, Devin sacrifices Gearhulk to Visceraseer, and scries away a card, as Randall remembers his draw from Garruk's Uprising. Devin then sacrifices Chainer to Visceraseer, and leaves the card he scries on top, as Randall passes off to Mark. Mark drops a Swamp. He casts a Vampiric Tutor, and loses 2 life, before putting a card on top of his library. After the Tutor, Mark casts the Death Cloud, where X is 3. There's no response, so each player loses 3 life, discards 3 cards, sacrifices 3 creatures, and then sacrifices 3 lands. And as everyone else resolves Death Cloud, Mark recasts his commander Tinybones, Death Cloud. Mark recasts his commander Tinybones, Death Cloud. Mark recasts his commander Tinybones, and draws a card while losing a life at his end step. Devin casts Waste Not, and passes off. Danny draws for turn, and passes off as well. Randall exiles Temur Sabertooth with Outpost Siege. He casts the Sabertooth, and draws from Garruk's Uprising as it enters. Randall then passes off. Mark drops a Swamp. He casts a Phyrexian Arena, and hits Danny with Tinybones in combat, before passing turn. Devin drops in an active Temple of the False God, and passes turn once again. Danny draws, and passes off, since he's mana screwed once again. Randall exiles Forerunner of the Empire with Outpost Siege. He casts the Forerunner in his main 1, and as it enters, he goes to put Portswood Crasher on top of his library. He then moves to combat, and hits Mark for 4 with Temur Sabertooth. Back in main 2, he drops the Temple of Abandon and passes turn. On his upkeep, Mark loses a life, before drawing an additional card thanks to Phyrexian Arena. He drops another Swamp, and casts a Wrench Mind targeting Randall. Randall discards Ram Through and Domri, which each trigger Waste Not, causing Devin to draw a total of 2. Mark then moves to end step, and draws a card from Tinybones, before passing off. Devin casts Necromancy, and uses it to reanimate Villas. He then passes off. Danny drops a Reliquary Tower. He's still mana screwed though, so he passes off once again. Randall exiles the Crasher with Outpost Siege. He casts it, and draws a card from Uprising as it ETBs. He plays the Mountain he drew for turn, and then passes off once again. On his upkeep, Mark loses another life, and draws an additional card from Phyrexian Arena. He drops his own Reliquary Tower, and casts a Jet Medallion, before passing off to Devin. And at Mark's end step, Devin activates Villas twice, losing a total of 4 life, and drawing 4 cards, to give Portswood Crasher -2/-2. Devin drops a Swamp, he casts an Altar of Dementia, and in response, Danny flashes in a Voracious Great Shark to counter it. Devin follows up with a Soldevi Adnate, and then casts a Buried Alive, which he uses to bin Gary, Shriekmaw, and Balathor the Defiled. Devin passes turn. Danny casts a Zami Lady of Scrolls. He activates her to draw a card, and misses another land drop, before once again passing off. Randall exiles Skyshroud Claim with Outpost Siege. He casts the claim, and goes to bring in both a Taiga and a Cinder Glade untapped. Randall then moves to combat, and swings Quartzwood Crasher at Mark for 6, before creating a 6/6 Dino on that damage. And with nothing else this turn, Randall passes off. Mark loses a life, and draws a card on his upkeep, as Randall remembers his draw from Uprising, and also steps things back to play an untapped Gruul Turf, while bouncing a mountain to hand, as Mark also plays a Swamp for turn. In his main 1, Mark casts a Mutilate. In response, Randall bounces both Forerunner and the Crasher back to hand with Temur Sabertooth, and then Mutilate gives all creatures on board -6/6 until end of turn. Mark recasts Tinybones again, and passes off to Devin. And at Mark's end step, Devin activates Villas twice, all for the sake of losing 4 more life to draw 4 more cards. Devin drops a Swamp for turn. He casts a Runescarred Demon, and goes to tutor up a Dance of the Dead to hand as it ETBs. He uses Dance of the Dead on Balathor, and then activates him to return all black or red creatures from graveyards to play under their respective owner's control. This triggers a whole bunch of ETBs, but the only really important one is Gary, who drains Devin's opponents for more than enough to eliminate them, in combination with Archfiend of Despair, ultimately meaning that Devin walks away with a win. So that's gonna do it for this week. Thanks as always to our players for being a part of this game. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and make sure to subscribe to see more of our Commander content, and to help us reach our goal of 5,000 subs by the end of the year. You can also support us over at Patreon, and join this list here. Thank you to Morello for your support so far. Alternatively, you can start any order you make at TCG Player by clicking our affiliate link down in the video's description. If you do, a portion of your total price goes directly towards supporting the channel at no additional cost to you. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm working on a little something for Double Masters, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. I'll see you back here next week with another gameplay video, and as always, thank you for watching.